IELTS Writing, Principles of Academic Writing, Part 2.
You are now listening to the IELTS podcast. Learn from tutors and ex-examiners who are masters of IELTS preparation. Your host, Ben Worthington.
Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me in the second part of this episode of the Principles of Academic Writing. Here we're going to just focus on giving you a good overall base and some very valuable tips on how to improve your writing, the kind of writing you should be aiming for, and the style. And the way I'll do this is that I found a good blog post called The Principles of Writing, but it was very general and it was talking more about blog writing, about like journalistic writing and maybe creative writing as well. So what I did is there's still a lot of gold in there in the article, and basically we're going through it and I'm applying it to English for academic purposes, but not just English for academic purposes, IELTS, specifically IELTS, because even though, all of these are connected, and even though English for academic purposes, for example, even though EAP is the style we need, we still need to modify it a little bit to get the points. You see, it's not as simple as writing normal academic English. We need to adapt it a little bit just to make sure we're getting the points. So let's start. So this is part 2. All the other parts we looked at: iteration, editing, unity, the mechanics, writing genuinely, your argument, the clarity, the principles. And now, specifically, we're going to look at the words. And the article says that you should not use jargon or cliches. And for IELTS writing, jargon is probably going to help you, because in the real world, it's called jargon. But in academic English or the IELTS world, it's called topic-specific vocabulary. And you might be able to hear me smile, or you might be able to hear me laugh, because it's so true. I tell all my students, they say something like, various people believe. And I say, okay, let's put some jargon in there. Let's improve that vocabulary. Instead of people, let's say various academic experts or various sociologists disagree or whatever. And I'm saying this because, like I said before, it's topic-specific vocabulary. Cliches, I guess, would be idiomatic expressions, idiomatic phrases. And this is really risky. In a podcast I did a while ago, we were looking at Band 9 essays, and the work, depending on the reader, some will call them cliches, and other people will say it's an expert use of the language. Unless you're really confident with it, don't do it, okay? Unless you're really confident and you know it's the exact and the correct and the most perfect idiomatic expression to put in there, then do it, go for it. But if you're having doubts, then perhaps it's the best idea to avoid it, okay? Now, here's one very useful tip, and you've probably heard it a million times but never done it, and that's read your sentences aloud. So pay attention to how the words sound when you put them together. And it's much easier said than done. And some of the points, according to the article, that you might want to consider is rhythm and using shorter sentences to carry a tremendous punch, according to the article. Now, here, what I would say in an IELTS context is the best way is to use a mixture of a short sentence and a long sentence, and introduce variety, because short sentences are powerful, but if you overuse them, it's going to be a complete disaster, because your writing will sound like that, then another sentence, then another sentence, and it's just going to kill the reader. However, if you mix it up with the longer sentences, it's variety, and if you do it in a coherent manner, it's going to make your writing flow a lot easier, because short sentences are powerful. They can communicate a single thing. And when I say in a short sentence, probably between 5 and 7 words in that sentence, and one clause, one single point, and their job is done. Next one, concrete language. This is very important. And if you've read some of the earlier posts, or you've listened to some of the earlier podcasts, you'll have heard me talk about the general paragraph structure going from general to specific. So we're starting with a general idea at the beginning and going to a very specific, solid, concrete example. And if we're given a very clear example, we cannot help but use concrete language. And the reason we have to use concrete language is because it's clearer and easier to grasp. The example in the article is very clear, so I'll use it. So for example, if I wanted to say something, if I used the words overcoming procrastination, overcoming procrastination, it's kind of vague. However, if I say ticking tasks off your to-do list, then that's solid. We know, we can visualize it. For example, I've said this a million times, but I'll just briefly go into it. If I say pollution is rising very fast and the world is getting warmer, okay, now if I convert that into an example and I say a recent study by the British government has showed temperature to be rising on average 5% every year. Now, massive difference there. It's concrete, it's solid, it's real, I can relate to it, and it's restating the argument. So, very valid point. Next one, paragraphs. Let's go. So, here you do not have much freedom, okay? Maybe 3 paragraphs in your IELTS academic task 1, maybe 3 in general task 1, between 4 and 5 for IELTS writing task 2. There's not much freedom here. However, you do want to be aware that you're going to pick up most of your points in the body paragraphs, and your conclusion and your introduction should be between 2 and 3 sentences each. But remember, points are in the paragraphs, your body paragraphs. Now, the next point in the article talks about the lead and the ending. And this is a very easy concept to understand, but it's not too easy to put into action, to actually apply to your essays. And there's a whole chapter, well actually it's not a whole chapter, it's just like a 10-minute module that explains it in much detail in the sentence guide. And for your paragraphs, basically we're going to be following the general to specific. I can't go into much detail because there's a whole chapter to it, and we describe what you have to put for each sentence. Each sentence is covered. Here's just a brief overview for the ending of your paragraph, your body paragraph. We do not summarize our points, okay? We do not summarize it because we're going to be repeating, and it's going to be laborious, and it's going to be boring, okay? So don't do that for your endings, okay? Also, don't use like cliches, and don't for your endings. This is Okay, unless, like I said before, you're rock solid sure that it's okay. Also, don't use a quotation. And even if you think you've got a really good one, I would still avoid it because it's quite dangerous. And really, especially in the exam, we're not risking things. We're just going to do stuff that we know has worked. If you're getting feedback on your essays, and if you're getting support and you're improving that way, for example, you've got a tutor with you who's supporting you, then you can experiment in this context. But even so, the chances of you being able to use a quotation in the actual exam are quite limited. So experimenting while you're doing your essay checks is an okay idea, but it's not something worth developing. I think personally, you might as well experiment with stuff that you are definitely guaranteed to be using in your exam, which might be a grammar structure, which might be some new vocabulary. Okay, so it's just how you allocate your time and how you direct your own learning. And by the way, the sentenceguide.com comes with about 8 essay checks just to make sure, absolutely certain, that you are improving and that you've got the skills down to perfection. Okay? And it's a very fast way of improving. The next point I want to mention is syntax and grammar, which in the IELTS is called grammatical range and accuracy. And here it mentions a very valid point about verbs. We should be using the active verbs, not the precise verbs. Active verbs move the sentence along, and it's just easier to read, and it's not strain on the reader. Okay, and we're going to use the active verbs obviously in active sentences. However, like we've said before, we do need to incorporate some passive structures just to show the examiner where we know other structures and to show them the range so the examiner can give us the points. But I'll just give you a quick example. It's from the article and it says, Joe saw him. That's immediately understandable. Joe saw him. 3 words, we know exactly what was going on. Now we go to a passive structure. He was seen by Joe. So we don't really understand what the sentence is saying until we get to the last word. And like I said previously, that creates strain. So we want to avoid this kind of strain, these passive structures. However, it's definitely worth using them at least once, perhaps twice, maybe 3 times, once in task 1 and then again in your task 2, twice maybe in your task 2, just to show the examiner that you know some structure. The next point in the article talks about adverbs, and it says most adverbs are unnecessary. This is true perhaps in the style of writing that this person has in mind, which may be blog writing, creative writing, or journalistic style writing. However, in the IELTS, especially task 1, it's necessary. Okay, because you're going to show the examiner with greater detail, and once again, you're going to show a wider range of vocabulary and a wider range of grammatical structures. So use your adverbs. But once again, it's like the passive. Don't fill your essay with adverbs, but use it at least once. Probably more than once in your academic task 1, but task 2, once is enough, once or twice. Adjectives. So according to most of the writing experts, you can usually find a verb that would do the job of the adjective, and then you're going to be able to use 1 word instead of 2 words words, which goes back to what we were writing before, what we were saying before about writing in a concise manner. However, we can use them in the IELTS because we want to show a range. We want to show the examiner we're familiar with them, and also it's quite a difficult skill to find the verb that can do the job of a verb and an adjective at the same time. Now then, the next one is qualifiers. Now, this is similar to what I talked about before, which is similar to hedging. The article says that you have to be lean, confident, you have to be bold, and you have to speak with authority. This is true to a certain extent for IELTS. But with IELTS, you want to avoid sweeping generalizations because you're writing in an academic style. So here I strongly encourage my students to use words like often, rarely, rather. And these words, what we do is we avoid making a solid statement that can be challenged, because we have to remember this is an academic context, and in academic writing we're expecting to be getting reviewed, and we need to sort of like protect our opinion or our personal selves from making these sweeping accusations. And I'll just give you a quick tutorial. So if we say all teenagers in England have tried smoking by the age of 16. That's an absolute statement, whereas the better way would be to say a large majority of students, or a large majority of teenagers, or most teenagers by the age of 16 have tried a cigarette. Okay? Might be better to say, anyway, I won't go into it, but that's how we hedge our writing. Now, punctuation. Next point, punctuation. So here it says break sentences into two shorter sentences, use the full stop. Kind of agree with this. However, like we've said before, longer sentences and shorter sentences used together show variety, helps us pick up points. Now, I do agree with this if your sentences is long. If you've got a body paragraph with 3 sentences, then probably one of them, at the very least, needs to be cut up. Also, there is a danger in writing long sentences, because the longer the sentence, the more dependence there is between the clauses, and that means that there's more chance of it being misunderstood or not even understood. Whereas a shorter sentence, 1 or 2 clauses, it's much easier to grasp and much less risk involved. Next one, do not ever use an exclamation point, okay? Not in any part of the IELTS writing. Even in task 1 general, actually I just contradict myself. In task 1 general, if it says write a letter to a friend, then you do, because it's informal. But the rest of the IELTS writing test will be formal academic writing, okay? And another thing that just popped into my mind, yesterday I was correcting an essay and he finished it with the end in capital letters and an exclamation mark, and I was like, oh dearie me. So that's just one point. Semicolons are useful as well, okay? And we can use this to introduce a pause and then maybe add some more information. And once again, this shows a range of structures, so that's definitely useful. The other ones, dash, wouldn't bother, nor would I bother with brackets. It's just not necessary. Now the final one, the comma, definitely, especially if we're doing the lists, which I encourage, and yeah, we need these. Just helps the sentence, makes it a little bit more understandable. Now, he's classified the next range as mood changes. And I would, and everybody else would, especially in an academic context, would call these conjunctions. These are definitely useful. One very valid point is, is using however at the end of the sentence. Don't bother, okay? Stick however in the middle of the sentence when you're balancing maybe two arguments, okay? Then a very concise description of the words yet and nevertheless. The description, he says, is yet and nevertheless can replace a whole long phrase that summarizes what the reader has just been told. Okay, so we're saying global warming, very bad, very dangerous, very selfish action. Nevertheless, it can, burning fossil fuels and paying scant regard to the environment can hasten economic growth and benefit job seekers indirectly. Okay, so what I did there is after the nevertheless, just completely disregarded all of my previous arguments, which is useful if we're going to be doing a discursive essay. So some of the other ones that he puts in there, the conjunctions, he calls them mood changes, which is kind of understood, kind of understandable, but which we should be using however, because it sounds more formal. Then we can use yet if we've already used however and we want to show some variety. Also, nevertheless, very useful. And then there's the other ones as well, which we can maybe use to finish, which might be thus and therefore, subsequently. Subsequently, by the way, is a useful one for your academic task 1. So we could say subsequently, it is clear most of the students preferred studying mathematics over geography. Another point, contractions. Okay, we don't use these in hardly any part of the exam, except if it says, write a letter to your friend describing what you did on your summer holidays. For example, IELTS General Task 1, informal letter to your friend. Okay, then you want to be sprinkling contractions and exclamations just to signal to the examiner you understand the task. Now, next chapter, our next point is about that and which. Here's a very good point. It says, that is what you would naturally say and therefore what you should write. So we can use which, but it's more for if we're identifying or locating or explaining or qualifies the phrase. Okay, so if we needed a comma, so the house, comma, which has a red roof, then we would use it. But I think the best way is if you're used to saying that and it sounds natural, then carry on using it. Okay? Only if you've practiced quite a lot with using which, then use it. And incidentally, what I started doing now with the students and seeing very good results is that if I see a student struggling with a certain structure or a certain word, I'll ask them to research it and write out 5 or 10 examples of that sentence or of that word until they've got it perfect. So we're approaching the end now, and I'll just quickly go through the last ones. The concept nouns is probably not necessary. These are nouns that express a concept instead of verbs. So we don't really need those, and this is definitely more related to like your blog writing or journalistic writing. The other one, nounism. This is basically when you're using nouns instead of verbs. There is a little bit of truth in this, that maybe we could use this just to vary our sentence structure, but as a rule, like I said before, if you can use the verb instead of the noun, you're probably on the right track. And also, if we go subject, verb, object, the structure that we mentioned before, it's much easier to use that if we're using the verbs instead of the nouns. Okay, so overstatement, this is completely unnecessary. This is when we just sort of like exaggerate, we overstate what was happening, so it's probably not relevant. Then the credibility, here we kind of touched on this with the examples, and this kind of just backs up what we're saying. So in the sentence guide, there's a whole chapter, I keep saying that, there's basically a 10-minute module showing you how to make your arguments believable and credible and rock solid as well. Next one, sexism. So if we can avoid this, all right, at most point, because we're not really here to argue of anything that we strongly believe in. We're here to pass the test, and we're just going to write what's necessary to pass the test. So we don't need to go into any kind of beliefs or arguments. All we want to do is pass the test. So let's avoid any kind of sexism and just check your writing for that. Okay, and probably you might not even see it in your writing. So that's another reason why you might want to get some why you might want to get some feedback. Okay, next ones, gender neutral pronouns. This is really important, and it's something that's quite tricky. So here the general rule I teach, and it works well, is to change it to the plural, and then we can use the neutral one, they, and we're not putting a sex, we're not putting a gender on the person in question. You see? So if we said, if a student wants to learn, he may want to start visiting a library more often. Whereas if we said, if students want to learn, they may want to visit a library more often. You see, the second one communicates the same. We're talking hypothetically, but we're talking in general, and we've made it neutral. And that's roughly it. Now, if you want to put any of this advice into action, I strongly recommend you do, and I strongly recommend that you write a summary of your key takeaways from this podcast. And yeah, if you want to apply those takeaways and check your writing the next time you've finished your writing, just check it with your summary of the stuff that you've learned from this podcast. Okay, did I use contractions? Does it sound sexist? Are there opportunities to use verbs instead of nouns? Could I introduce more sentence structures? Could I split up a long sentence to make it easier to understand? All these things. And then if you still want to get more feedback, which I would definitely recommend, have a look at IELTSwritingtask.net. You can get your essay checked there. It'll be by myself or another tutor. There will be, and it's just an easy, fast way to improve. Okay, you get feedback, you implement the corrections, and you send some more essays, and there's no shortcut. Okay, it takes a bit of preparation, takes a little work and some determination. But like I've said a million times before, if you've got this far in learning English and you can understand me, then you are very, very close. So just keep on pushing and improving. Okay, that's it from me. If you know anybody who's struggling with IELTS, you might want to send them a link for IELTS podcast, or just tell them about this podcast series. Have a look in the archives as well. There's plenty of older podcasts with lots of value there. And if you've got your exam coming up, you might want, if you've got it coming up in the next month or in the next 2 weeks, you might want to have a look at sentenceguide.com. And at the moment, it's me correcting the essays. So it's a good time just to jump in there, get your writing under control, and you'll see an instant improvement. I'm not exaggerating. You'll see an instant improvement as soon as you start the course and as soon as you start submitting your essays. Okay, have a fantastic day, and thanks very much for listening, and all the best in your exams.
Thanks for listening to IELTSPodcast.com.